Within the 3D view window, there are several modes. If you click on this little selection here, we bring up a menu of all the different types of modes. The default mode is Object Mode. Object Mode lets you select and manipulate objects as a whole, changing things like location, rotation, and scale. In Object Mode, you do not edit the individual components that make up the shape of an object. So a cube will always look like a cube, a sphere will always look like a sphere, etc. To select an object, right-click on it. Selected objects will be highlighted orange. There are several types of objects in Blender. You can have a mesh, a lamp, a camera, an armature, a curve, etc. Each type of object has its own purpose, but the main type of object in any 3D modeling program is a mesh. A mesh is made up of points called vertices, lines called edges, and planes called faces. These components of a mesh make up the shape of the object. Most of the other types of objects are there to manipulate meshes in one way or another. For instance, a lamp casts light onto a mesh, and a camera takes a picture of a mesh. One thing that all objects in Blender have in common is that they all have a center point represented by this little orange dot, which is called the origin. The origin defines the location, rotation, and scale of an object. If we click up here on this little plus and drag, it'll pop out the little properties menu for our object. If we scroll up to our transform section, we can see a section for location, rotation, and scale. These values correspond to the origin. They define the origin along the x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. If you change any of these values, the origin and all the mesh data that goes with it will be changed too. So for instance, if we go under location and we look at the x-axis value, which is currently at 0, and we pull on it, increasing the value, we can see that it moves along the x-axis. If we pull along the y value, it will move along the y-axis. Rotation is similar. If we pull on this, we will rotate on the x-axis. If we pull on this, we will rotate on the y-axis. Oops. If we pull on this, we will rotate along the z-axis. Scale is also similar. Pull on this, pull on this, pull on this, and we change the scale. Here's where it might be a little confusing. These values are corresponding to the origin, not to any particular point on the object. You'll notice that in location, if we look at the z-axis, which is up and down, it is currently at 0, which means that it's along the floor. But you'll notice that part of the cube is below the floor. This is because these numbers are referring to the origin, not the mesh data. So rather than defining one of these corners, or any point within this area here, or any point up here, these values correspond to this point only. If we look at this object from a top view, and we press Z to go into Wireframe, we can see the grid that these numbers correspond with. So in location, this is the y-axis, and if we go 1, 2, 3, about 3.5, which is about where the origin is, we can look up at the number here, and sure enough, the number is 3.6, which is roughly 3.5. So this number is corresponding to that point, rather than this whole cube. If you tried to define this whole cube as being up by 3.6, you'd have a hard time deciding exactly what point to measure by, which is what the origin is for. Earlier, we said that right-clicking selects objects. Left-clicking places what's called the 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is this crosshair-looking thing that is a lot like your mouse for your computer, but it's for a 3D space in Blender. Unlike your mouse, which can only work in a 2D area, the 3D cursor also has depth. So the 3D cursor is part of the 3D view, and it's defined by an X, Y, and Z value. If we scroll down on this menu here, we come down to 3D cursor, we can see the X, Y, and Z values. And just like an object, we can pull on these and move the 3D cursor around. The 3D cursor is useful for lots of little things in Blender. One of the most noticeable things you use it for is when you add new objects to Blender. To add a new object, go to the Add menu, Mesh, let's say a UV sphere. I'll just press period on the numpad to zoom into that, and you'll notice that the sphere appeared exactly where we had the 3D cursor. So if I click over here to place the 3D cursor somewhere else, and then we go back to our Add menu, Mesh, and do a cone, now we have a cone over at where we placed the 3D cursor. To reset the 3D cursor to the center, press Shift-C. Rather than going up here to press Add and see your Add menu, you can use Shift-A to bring up your Add menu wherever your mouse is. So those are some of the core concepts when working with objects in object mode in Blender.